think this will be okay. Can everybody hear me? All right. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be with you to talk about this topic today, which I think is a fascinating one from a variety of different perspectives. And I was further introduced to this topic, I guess, unexpectedly, just in the last month since Rebecca invited me to do this event. I came upon, kind of unexpected discovery. My own family, on my father's side, is descended from Hungarian Jews. In fact, my great grandparents moved in the 1920s to Little Budapest in Cleveland, specifically fleeing the rising anti-Semitism in the region of Hungary near the Ukrainian border. I found all this out in my 40s because there was a researcher doing a work on my great uncle, my father's uncle, who was a bank robber, actually, and in the sort of the fascination with true crime that we have going on in popular culture these days, he has become a figure of interest. And this researcher came to visit my father, who's in his 80s, and did know his uncle very well, and revealed to him all of this research he had done about my family's immigration and their origins and so on and so forth. And so a kind of fascinating, for me, autobiographical discovery, and something that is present, somewhat to my surprise, even in Twain's work. That one of the essay that I'll spend the most time talking about today, called Concerning the Jews, Twain mentions and theorizes about the fact that there are far more people of Jewish descent living in the United States than any census or any estimate shows, particularly in the time that this essay is published in 1899. And the most recent statistics he had at that time was that there were about 250,000 American Jews. We now know the more recent statistics suggest that was a large undercount. Maybe there were more than 1 million, and Twain theorizes, as is probably pretty realistic, that in many cases there were people of Jewish descent, perhaps even people who were practicing Judaism, who did not report themselves to the census takers. Okay. Or who were in the process, as certainly my family was, of essentially secularizing. Right? And I think this is something that Twain alludes to and talks about, and to some extent has a sort of regret for. Right? That there is enough prejudice and persecution in the United States, even though he believes it is far less than what he sees in Europe, that there are so many people who feel afraid, right, to identify as Jewish. Right? I'm going to open then the sort of formal part of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to being able to talk and answer questions in the latter part of this session. But I'm going to open my formal part of my presentation by talking a little bit about this essay. Okay. But before I do so, I just wanted to point out this quotation, which I've shared, that characterizes something that or fits in with things that Twain said throughout his life. I've never felt disposition to satirize the Jews. We do not satirize people whom we singularly respect. Right? And this was a kind of thing that, and he says because we couldn't do it well, right? But this is something he would refer to over and over again. that he doesn't find anything about the lot of Jews to be a source of humor, right? And I think this is a particularly interesting claim for one of the world's foremost humorists at the time, and also because, as I'm sure you are aware, right, the sort of stereotype, archetypal figures of of the Jew, the wandering Jew, so on and so forth, were often used in wide varieties of humorous traditions in the United States and abroad, including by some of Twain's own sort of literary comrades. Thomas Nast, of course, was somebody who he worked with and who, whose anti-Semitic caricatures of Jews are present throughout the newspapers and magazines of the mid-19th century. Many of the literary figures who were published in the same magazines, people like Frank Norris and Henry James, have instances of sort of overt and harmful anti-Semitism in their work. Right? And this is something that Twain felt was beneath him, right, and arguably beneath his literary compatriots as well. Right? I'm having trouble again. Why is this? Okay. This is the essay that I made reference to, right, from Harper's New Monthly Magazine in September of 1899. When we talk about Mark Twain and Judaism, right, and the history of Jewish people in the United States and Europe through his career, this is the essay that is most often cited, and it covers a number of different topics, as I will talk about in a moment. But I wanted to first sort of place this essay and Twain's broader fascination with the lot of Jews in Europe in his biographical context. And I think that many of you may be familiar with Mark Twain from a different era in his career, right? That the most famous work Twain's life, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is published in 1885. And it is sort of a centerpiece, kind of mid-career for Twain, and that his transition from being a steamboat pilot and then later a miner and prospector into being an editor and a wildcat journalist, and then eventually a self-described humorist and author and novelist. That all happens essentially during the Civil War in the early 1860s. Okay. And then he spends over a decade in the sort of ascendance from the wildcat journalism of the frontier into a kind of canonized literary figure, on the East Coast, of course, settling in Hartford, Connecticut. He makes an enormous amount of money off of a series of books published between 1869 and 1875. Or 1876, I'm sorry, when Adventures of Tom Sawyer is published. And because of that success, he is able to essentially determine his own modes of production, right? And he buys, first he buys a newspaper, later he buys a publishing house, and he publishes his own works through that publishing house, thus able to retain a larger share of the proceeds. He also publishes a number of other works, including one of the most popular books of the 19th century, the autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant. But in 1893, after a fairly strong run of success at the publishing house, he undertakes a number of expensive projects with the expectation that they will have a long-term payout. But in 1893, the U.S. suffers an intense financial crisis. And literally thousands of businesses go bankrupt during that time, including in the latter stages of the crisis. Twain overextended with his investments both at the publishing house and with some printing technology, something known as the page typesetter. He goes bankrupt as well. And this is, he, as a sort of one of the primary cultural celebrities of his age, this is quite a story. It's something that is going to be covered widely in the newspapers, in the press, and it is a source of a great deal of shame and embarrassment for Twain. And as in the aftermath of that embarrassment, he decides, through a consultation with one of his good friends, Henry Rogers, who is one of the executives at the Standard Oil Company, he decides that he is going to repay all of his debts in full. And in order to do that, he undertakes a global lecture tour. He decides not to sell off his copyrights, not to sell off his works, which he believes will have, a long-term profitability. Instead, he decides to undertake a global lecture tour. He literally visits countries and regions on every continent, spends time in New Zealand and Australia, in India, in South Africa, throughout Europe, and some of the Asian islands as well. Right? So, as a product of this, he returns essentially to the United States after several years as one of the most famous men in the world. And this is what many of his obituary writers in 1910 will refer to him as the most famous man on earth, right? That he attains a kind of cultural celebrity that was largely unprecedented in the early 20th century, right? This is before television, before cinema, right? That the capacity for sort of gaining a global audience is just emerging, and Twain is one of the first people to have that kind of worldwide name recognition, particularly among the first people who isn't a political figure or a military commander, somebody who is associated with the operation of the state. And so this global lecture tour is undertaken in 1895. In the aftermath of it, he is able to repay his debtors, and not only repay his debtors, but he returns his family to sort of prosperity. He signs a large contract with Harper Brothers to publish his complete works, as well as the promise of new works. But unfortunately, during this same period, his eldest daughter, Susie, dies unexpectedly in her early 20s of an unexpected onset of spinal meningitis. And this is a kind of turning point in Twain's biography. Both he has this return to prosperity and this emerging fame, right, that is going to give him a kind of notoriety and an access to media that very few other figures have during the early part of the 20th century. But he also is unfettered, increasingly unfettered in the late 1890s and throughout the first decade of the 20th century. In the aftermath of his grief, he starts to write primarily for himself. And he becomes much less self-censorious, right? He is willing to talk and write about things that very few other authors are interested in sharing. And so we have, during that time, okay, one of the things that he publishes is concerning the Jews, and he is self-conscious that it is going to be a controversial essay. It's published in Harper's in September of 1899. He is inspired in large part, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, by Emile Zola, and specifically what he thinks of as the greatest newspaper article ever written, J'accuse, right? That was part of the Dreyfus affair in France, and which accused the French government and the French military of persecuting Dreyfus for anti-Semitic reasons, right? And this is, Twain is very, very influenced by Zola and by this incident specifically. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And it's clearly one of the inspirations for authoring concerning the Jews. But I would also point out that this work is part of a kind of ongoing critique of race, ethnicity, imperialism that is going to continue throughout the remainder of Twain's life, right? The topics of prejudice and discrimination are going to be kind of constant on his mind in a wide variety of ways throughout the final decade of his career. Okay. This is an interesting essay within the field of Twain studies. in part because it is one that we often quote from, right? But oftentimes we quote out of context. And this is one such example, that we have this reference to his lack of prejudice, and also to his sort of distaste or discrediting of mankind, right? Of humanity, of human nature, his sympathy with Satan. These are all things that Twain scholars have a tendency to quote from, right? But oftentimes when they do that quoting, they don't necessarily make reference to the larger context in which these words were written as an introduction to this essay concerning the Jews. And part of the reason for that, I think, I hazard this guess, right, is that this essay initially it was used frequently as an example of Twain's egalitarianism, right? His absence of prejudice, and he himself uses it that way. However, in the latter part of the 20th century, it also is treated as evidence of philo-Semitism, right? That is a tendency in trying to produce works that are laudatory about Jews. Oftentimes authors and other would-be allies reveal themselves to be, conditioned by stereotypes and reproduce those stereotypes in ways that, though they intend them to be positive, can be appropriated to negative purposes, right? And indeed, the most extreme example of this that it has been found is that Twain's essay was sometimes used by Nazi propagandists, or at least elements of Twain's essay were used by Nazi propagandists. Again, not for the purposes he intended them, right? But because he was, participating in recapitulating stereotypes, which he saw as positive, but which could be viewed negatively. Among them, most of all, right, is Twain's opinion that Jews are better at business, right? And he draws this in a wide variety of ways, including a kind of what I think is a fairly interesting historical analysis of the ways in which Jews were denied access to many of the professions in Europe throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And as a result, they, oftentimes migrated towards things like finance and became, well established in that field as a result of being able to, participate in share in usury, right, in the loaning of money, right? And Twain recognizes that this is something that a field in which they entered because of prejudice and discrimination, and that then they are further discriminated against as a result of becoming a recognizable group or constituency within that profession. And again, this is oftentimes alluded to as one of the ways in which Twain is guilty of philo-Semitism, right? That he sees Jews as superior both intellectually and specifically in the field of business. And by trying to laud this constituency in those ways, he also produces the idea of a kind of leveling stereotype, a kind of uniformity that is obviously one of the sources of discrimination and prejudice. One of the things that I want to draw attention to about this essay more generally is, although it is attempting to construct a very consistent and regimented argument, it is a chaotic work in a number of different ways. Like much of Twain's work from this period, it moves back and forth between the sincere and the sort of regimented, rational argumentation and the forms of satire and irony that he was most famous for. part of this is that Twain is, as I said before, increasingly writing for himself, and he doesn't have the kind of editing that he might have had at a previous era of his career, either from himself or from his his professional allies. Right? He wants to take risks. He wants to do things that are unusual. Oftentimes, this is very rewarding, particularly at the sentence level. Right? Some of his aphorisms from this period, some of the things, some of the anecdotes that he writes, the short forms are just beautiful and wonderful and incisive. But on the higher order issues, oftentimes he is a little bit idiosyncratic and chaotic and unregimented. Right? And so I made a list of the many things that he takes on in this relatively short, it's only about a 6-page magazine essay. The power of political organizing, urban cultures of mainland Europe, Christian hypocrisy, legislative obstructionism, that's particularly in the United States, the ethics of business, the history of European finance, I mentioned earlier, antebellum Southern prejudices towards Yankees, particularly New Yorkers, the Dreyfus affair, Irish immigrant political organizing in the US, the reliability or unreliability of demographic statistics, religious versus racial prejudice and persecution. This is something that Twain is clearly trying to tease out. Like, what is the difference between prejudice against Judaism based upon the religious content and prejudice against Jews based upon ethnicity and race, right? And then finally, military participation as evidence of patriotism, right? It's a ranging, complicated essay with there's a lot going on, and he in fact expands it when he includes it in book form a few years later, adding additional content, right? But the essay is inspired, and I think this is really important for our understanding of it. It is inspired by letters that he received, and specifically the essay reprints at the beginning a letter he received from an American citizen, an American Jew, and Twain takes that as inspiration, as impetus to write this essay, right? And he lists near the beginning of the essay the 6 points that are made by the person who wrote him this letter, that he doesn't name this person, right? That he is going to discuss, questions or considerations that he wants to address. Right? And this reveals, I think, in some ways, what I mentioned earlier, the extent of Twain's celebrity. Right? One thing that we know about this period is he was inundated by mail, by what we might call fan mail today. Okay? And he was eager to engage with his public in various forms. He oftentimes returned letters. He saved much of his correspondence. He annotated it in various ways, and he frequently used it as a way to ignite other forms of writing. This is most famous in his autobiography, where if you read his 3-volume, 30,000-page autobiography, one of the things that you will see over and over again is he's reading a newspaper article, he receives a letter from a friend or from a fan, and he includes that in the body of the autobiography, and then he uses it as a way to get his own writing process started, right? And this is something that he's doing continuously over the course of the 1890s and first decade of the 20th century. And again, I just want to reemphasize that this is part of his increasing understanding of what it means to be a celebrity, to be a public figure, particularly a cultural celebrity, right? He wants to be engaged with his public. And part of the reason he is so successful is that he shows a great deal of deference to the people who are reading him, writing to him, showing interest in his work in various ways. I want to also acknowledge that I am sort of drawing a lot of my arguments today from the work of another Twain scholar, Shelley Fisher-Fishkin, who tries to sort of push back to some extent against the accusations of philo-Semitism leveled against Twain from a previous generation, and essentially argues in literally at the end of this essay, right, that he was far ahead of the curve. Right. While she acknowledges that there are some problems with concerning the Jews, she also wants to draw our attention to the ways in which he was contradicting, right, the widespread anti-Semitism in both the American and European press. Right? And if we try to extract this essay from those contexts, it looks very different. Right? And one of the points that she makes that I want to draw attention to is that a good deal of Twain's affection for American Jews and therefore for European Jews later in his life comes from the time he spent out west. That there were, particularly in San Francisco, large communities of Jewish descendants or Jewish immigrants. Right? Most notably, in Twain makes reference to Adolf Sutro, who was an engineer, a financier, and eventually the mayor of San Francisco, who was part of a community that two communities to which Twain also belonged, in San Francisco and also in Virginia City, Nevada. They crossed paths on numerous occasions and were both involved in a kind of suppressed period in American history, particularly in San Francisco, where there was a deeply racist, borderline fascist regime that controlled the city of San Francisco through much of the 1850s and 1860s. And the only way that that regime was eventually overthrown was through a kind of coalition of groups that included the Jewish community of San Francisco. It included the journalists, including Twain. It included Chinese laborers and Chinese immigrants, oftentimes who were working, who were brought to the United States for railroad labor. It included African American migrants, formerly enslaved people, and that these coalitions, in many ways, worked together during the 1860s to bring about regime change in San Francisco. And Twain, this is an aspect of Twain's career that often gets suppressed, that he was sort of openly hostile to the control over this kind of autocratic control of particularly the police commissioner in San Francisco during this time. And his writing led in many ways to the end of that era, right? That he called out the police commissioner. He was harassed, he was imprisoned, he was beaten up, he was exiled, but nonetheless, he persisted and gained a number of allies through that period, including Adolf Sutro, who would be part of the sort of Reformation project in late 19th century San Francisco. And I think this is one of the core things to remember. It's a sort of important aspect of Twain's studies in general, that Twain is, he's a dynamic figure, right? He comes out of a very prejudiced society, rural Missouri in the antebellum period. His father owned slaves. He's surrounded by the plantation economy. He is invested with all sorts of prejudices against ethnic groups, against races, and even against, as he points out in Concerning the Jews, the Yankee, right? And so the long project of Twain's life is, to some extent, to overcome these prejudices. And the way he overcomes it is often by seeing a wide variety of ethnicities, races, genders, so on and so forth, working multilaterally. Okay? There's a great recent book by Swan Su who argues that Twain doesn't understand just how bad Black slavery is in the South until he sees the ways that Chinese workers are treated in San Francisco, right? That he's not capable of reflecting back upon the culture of his youth until he sees the abuse of a different racial group as an adult. And his sort of sensitivity to the injustice and the abuse of Chinese laborers in San Francisco leads him to be to take more consideration of the plight of Black people in the South, both before and after the Civil War. Fishkin points out, right, that Twain's interest in Jews goes back to before, long before he's living in Europe and he's writing and composing concerning the Jews. The very first book that earns him a reputation, published in 1869, The Innocents Abroad, includes a kind of satiric speech which he gives to Romans who are asking him about what it's like to live in America. And he gives a series of examples. He talks about newspapers, he talks about the Congress, all of these things in kind of parodic, satiric fashion. But one of the things he makes reference to is the ways in which Jews are treated differently than they are treated in Italy. And as Fishkin points out, many of the forms of prejudice and discrimination he makes reference to were either in practice at that time or were in living memory. And so there's an awareness of anti-Semitism that dates back at least to the 1860s and is evident in Twain's work. But I think one of the turning points is that he is living in Europe, in Germany and Austria primarily, during the time of the Dreyfus affair. And in fact, he is deeply moved by, as I said earlier, Émile Zola's article, J'accuse. He says it's one of the best evidences of what newspapers can do, what the press, the best version of what the press can do. He applauds Zola as a realist, but also as a powerful polemicist. He clearly finds a kind of affection with Zola on a number of subjects, including his fascination with Joan of Arc. And since he's living in Europe in 1897 and 1898, even going back to 1895, right? He's essentially in Europe throughout the time that the sort of, the Dreyfus trials are ongoing. And he offers to Chatto and Windows, one of the publishers he has a relationship with in it, to write a book about Dreyfus, to write a book about what he's seeing, to compile the way the news is being propagated in various European nations and various European cultures, and to apply it to an American audience. And he sees this as an incredibly promising project and one which is really important for American audiences to gain more awareness of, right? He thinks that there are things that are going on in Europe that are sort of dramatically changing the global geopolitic. And he thinks many of his American readers are not sufficiently aware of these events. And so he offers to write this book, and he starts writing it, and the publisher backs away. Right? And the publisher backs away very specifically because they are worried about the extent to which Twain is interested in this project because he wants to address anti-Semitism. And the more that he talks about in his early chapters, he talks about the extent to which the Dreyfus affair was driven by a culture of anti-Semitism in France and throughout Europe, and the publisher backs off of their interest, despite the fact, as I said, this is Twain at the very height of his celebrity, right? Everybody wants books, magazine articles, essays, stories by Mark Twain, and yet they don't want this particular story. This is something that sticks with him. Right. And this is a kind of theme if we look at Twain's career, that his interest in depicting and discussing the issues surrounding Jewish discrimination and Jewish stereotypes are oftentimes censored by editors and publishers. And it's only posthumously that we have become sort of aware and had access to some of the things that Twain was writing and interested in exploring, including these two fragments, these two stories, one of which was presumably intended to be included in Following the Equator, but was left out of the final manuscript, or possibly because the publishing house was not willing to entertain what was a kind of a contrarian vision of an antebellum American Jew who was a kind of heroic figure, somebody who participated in duels, who defended the honor of women. That this is a kind of Jewish cowboy figure, and he was edited out of the of Following the Equator for reasons that are not entirely clear. And we see in Twain's private writings the extent to which this is an ongoing fascination, right? And this, for me, is maybe what motivates me around this topic the most, is the extent to which he understands that the prejudice and discrimination of European Jews in particular is part of a larger set of forces, dynamic, violent, very global forces, right, that are unsettling the norms of Europe. And in these two letters to his two best friends of this time, right? Joseph Twitchell is a Hartford minister who has been Twain's best friend since he moved to Hartford in the early 1870s. Henry Rogers is that executive at Standard Oil who was Twain's business manager, and in many ways he credits with saving him from the worst effects of his bankruptcy. These are his two best friends, and in writing to them, we get a sense of just how interested he is in the cultures of Jewish people in Europe. And also, it reiterates to some extent the claims of philo-Semitism, right? That he idealizes, heroizes, right? Idolizes Jews in a way that perhaps flattens them, right? And he has this idea of their not just ethical superiority, but intellectual superiority. Right? But I think what's most interesting is that he embeds, and most interesting for me in this, is he embeds this in the changing politics of Europe at this time, right? The clash of the Czech and Austrian, he says here, I wish I could understand these quarrels, but of course I can't. What he's seeing during the time he lives in Europe is the emergence of a merchant class, the hollowing out of the landed gentry, the changing norms for aristocracy, a collision between aristocracy and the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, right? That he is seeing the sort of norms of Europe change, affected in some part by the rising success of industrial America. Right? And he feels as though this is a tense place. This is a fire keg. And he sees revolutions happening or on the verge of happening in several places. And he frames this, at least in part, around the prejudice and discrimination towards the Jew. One of the points that he makes before the article that precedes concerning the Jews is that the revolutionary violence that takes place in Vienna in the mid-1890s is not caused in any way by Jewish people, but they are the primary victims, right? That in the aftermath of that violence, they are targeted and anti-Semitism is on the rise. Of course, this is going to be a formula that we see over and over again in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so in some ways, Twain is kind of prophesizing, anticipating, seeing the forces at play that will, of course, become more striking and at least more canonized in the interwar period. Right? I also think it's particularly interesting in this letter to Rogers, right, that he says, "There's one thing I'd like to say, but I dare not, right? Christianity has deluged the world with blood and tears. Judaism has caused neither for religion's sake." Right? But he crosses out this line before he sends the letter on to Rogers. And only through our sort of material analysis of the document in the 20th century were we able to recover those lines. And it's something that I see over and over again in Twain, is that he says these things, he makes these sort of extreme and I think oftentimes very incisive claims about Christianity, about American exceptionalism, about Eurocentrism, but he's tentative even in his private correspondence sometimes to stick to them. There's a passage I've been looking at recently in his journals from the 1880s where he goes to see a speech by Frederick Douglass, and Douglass is chastising the old planter class. And Twain writes in his journal this, really sort of aggressive statement about the failures of Southern culture. But then he crosses out the strongest version of it and replaces it with a slightly weaker version, even though it's just in a journal, even though it's in a diary form. Nobody else is supposedly going to see it. But he's cautious sometimes about taking things too far, particularly against those groups which he and his family identify with, right? Christians, Southerners, Americans, etc. And this is all part of, he's working through these issues during the 1890s in a series of books in which we have Americans acting as kind of arbiters of the changing landscape of Europe. Right? Particularly the collision between a kind of aristocratic Europe and a democratic Europe, right? The changing landscape of geopolitics that Twain is sort of working out in various forms in a series of books, both travelogues and novels. And we have these strange figures like Hank Morgan in King Arthur's Court, the American claimant, Joan of Arc, who are both kind of proletarian, everyman, democratic American figures, but they are also fetishizing the history of European monarchs. Right? And Twain is dramatizing that over and over again, including, I think, in his attempt to understand the prejudice against Jews in Vienna and Berlin and the other places he visits. And one of the most striking, and I'm nearing the end here, but one of the most striking passages from Concerning the Jews is this response that he gives to the question of whether Jews will ever be able to get beyond persecution. And he says, to some extent, no, but also that it doesn't really matter, right? That they do not think that the Jew need now stand in any fear of being robbed and raided. Among the high civilizations, he seems to be a very comfortably situated indeed, and to have more than his proportionate share of the prosperities going, right? And of course, reading this passage, knowing what we know now, right, is very, very striking, right? That this was, on the verge not of a relief of anti-Semitism, but actually growing and extremized and autocratic forms of anti-Semitism. And he closes then, and I will close as well, right, with this kind of optimistic, idealistic, again, the sort of philosemitic idea of that despite the relatively small size of the Jewish community globally, it has this huge proportion of the kind of great names, as he calls them, in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine. Right? He again commends the idea of Jewish intellectualism, right, that he sees and believes heartily in. Right, that even he points this out earlier in the essay. Even when denied access to the institutions of education, Jewish communities have found ways over and over again to thrive in intellectual pursuits. Right, whether they are science, business, medicine, the arts. Right, he sees this as one of the most commendable things. And so he closes with this idea that he's able to through his research, he has seen evidence of a great deal of prejudice and persecution against Jews that predates even Christianity. Right? And he looks to the ancient Greek and Roman texts for evidence of persecution of Jews then. And so he says this is not purely, a kind of outcome of Christian, prejudice, of Christian hypocrisy, so on and so forth. And yet, his argument is Jews will outlive them all, right? That all of their persecutors, all of the people who have discriminated against them, they have outlived those civilizations, have outlived those societies, right? And they will continue to. And this is a sort of idea of immortality that he concludes with. And I'm going to conclude there too. I'm eager, happy, excited to take your questions either about this topic specifically or about Twain and his world generally. And I'm going to try to exit my screen and open the chat. Let me see here. I see some great recommendations. Hal Holbrook, right? How did he fund his world travel? I'll start here. This looks like it's the earliest question. So he was able to finance his world travel in large part because he had investors. Okay. There were, a number of touring companies, opera houses, booking agents, so on and so forth. He always, this is a kind of interesting, maybe largely unknown facet of Twain's career. He was always in more demand as a lecturer than he was as a novelist or journalist or essayist or short story writer. Okay? That from a very early phase, essentially in the 1867, he gives his first lecture in San Francisco. Maybe it's 1866. And essentially from that point forward, he can always depend on making a quick buck by going out on the road. Okay? He is one of the sort of formative figures in the genre of stand-up comedy. Okay? He doesn't like doing this work. I think this is a crucial piece, right? He does not really like lecturing. He finds it tiresome, tedious. It takes a lot of energy. He has to travel mostly by rail and by steamboat. And it takes, the older he gets, the harder that toll takes on him. But he does always know that there are people willing to pay for him to speak. Okay. And so that is what happens in 1895 is for the first time in over a decade, he goes back out on the road, and there is enormous demand all over the world for these performances. And so it's easy for him to finance it through various means, and he makes an enormous sum of money. And I think one of the things people, maybe aren't aware of is that Twain leaves behind a legacy that's the equivalent of about $40 million today. Right? Twain, he loses all his money famously in the 1890s, but he gets it all back and more, right? An incredibly prosperous author, right? There is really no precedent for it prior to the mid 20th century, an author who makes that kind of money. And he makes a lot of it because he always has this ability to turn back to lecturing, to turn back to what is essentially stand-up comedy, to, and he can book every size of venue. Yes, I can definitely send these. I can send these articles to Rebecca, and so that you can have access to them. Um, yeah. So I think the Herzl that's being referred to here by Deborah is somebody who Twain was friends with when he lived in Vienna, and who was the translator, I believe, for Zola's JQs, and so they're constantly in conversation throughout the time that he's in Vienna. And I would say that Twain's understanding of the Dreyfus affair owes more to Herzl than probably anybody, maybe with the exception of Zola. Yeah, well, so he writes both that Jews and Christians be damned. Yeah, I think we do have to put that within the context of Twain's particular sense of humor and his use of hell and Satan as both sources of humor and satire, and also a kind of affection. Right? That he sees Satan as a persecuted figure, right? And he sees the Christian vision of heaven as one that is kind of demented, right? And so there's a trope that runs throughout Twain's work of trying to kind of invert our expectations when it comes to heaven and hell, when it comes to damnation and salvation. One of the books that's published a little bit later after this is Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven, which is about a kind of Twain-esque Southerner visiting the Christian vision of heaven that is outlined in Gates Ajar, a very popular book from the a kind of evangelist book from the mid 19th century. And Twain imagines this figure who's a little bit like himself, visiting heaven or being sent to heaven after dying, and absolutely hating everything about it, or at least hating portions of it, being surprised by portions of it. And so in saying that both Jews and Christians be damned, right, he is in some ways playing upon this consistent trope in his work of sort of like, seeing the whole, notion of damnation as something that is, is mythic, is mystical, is not to be taken seriously. I'm definitely familiar with the quotes about Palestine, and there's in fact there's some really great work by Hilton Obenzinger, who studied the sort of ways in which Palestine was represented in 19th century American culture and what Twain's doing in that passage. And so I would just turn, we've got an essay from him on our website, and I'd be happy to share the link to it. And I think it's, oftentimes those passages are appropriated for various political means in the 20th and 21st century. And he gets into some of the reasons why. Were there other philosemitic public figures at the time? I'm sure that there were. I don't have a particular example in mind. And definitely that that was not amongst the sort of American authors who we oftentimes point out as, Twain's comparables. Henry James, Frank Norris, uh, I'm trying to think of the guy's name who it's not coming to me, but amongst his sort of so-called peers, Twain was clearly an outlier in taking this position, right? Far more commonly in American literature from this period, we get the kind of shameful, prejudicial, stereotypical depictions of Jews, right? Jokes about big noses and short people and, money grubbing and so on and so forth. These things appear all the time in American literature, including by people who, should know better. Right. And that's, something that Twain is definitely trying to, to resist and evade. What about banning Twain's work? Yeah, so this is something we think and talk about a lot, obviously at the Center for Mark Twain Studies, and we have written a number or have published people writing editorials about it. I think that it probably goes without saying that we think all forms of censorship are, unproductive. And yet, what I will say about Twain takes a position throughout his entire life and career, one that I think is maybe encouraging for us now. He takes the position that that censorship almost always helps the author who is being censored. Right? That whenever there is an attempt by a politician, by a school board, right, to to excise his books from the library, to remove them from curriculums, to derogate them in some way, shape, or form, it almost always increases his sales. Okay. And he even goes so far as to say, not only are people more likely to buy my books when they are being censored, right? But they're more likely to actually read them. That when there is controversy, when there is a censorship debate, when there is something, a kind of political scandal associated with the work of literature, it almost always encourages people to go look at that literature. Right? I think about some of the recent scandals about critical race theory and books that are being taught in primary and secondary schools, and oftentimes books that are named in speeches by politicians who are opposed to them see their sales skyrocket on Amazon. Right? There's no more certain way to get a teenager interested in reading than to tell them they're not allowed to. Right? And that was something that Twain definitely believed strongly in, and I think it definitely is a site of encouragement for me as we see these emerging censorship debates that recycle over and over and over again. This is one of the things that Toni Morrison points out when she's talking about Huckleberry Finn. It's one of the things that she commends the novel for, is that it continues to be scandalous. It continues to be controversial. Over 100 years after it has been published, right? And it's controversial in the late 20th century when she's writing that essay for entirely different reasons than why it was controversial in 1886, the first time it got banned from a library, right? And she said that as a novelist herself, Toni Morrison says that's what you want. Like, if you can imagine being so relevant 120 years after you've published something that people want to get rid of it, like, that is probably a good sign and a good evaluation of your literature. Did he pass on his I love this one. Did he pass on his egalitarian views to his family? I would actually argue, if anything, it moves to some extent in the opposite direction. And that although there's many points in Twain's career where he is moving in a more egalitarian direction, one of the foremost moments is when he marries Livy Clemens. Okay? That Livy Langdon, who would become Livy Clemens, is part of one of the most progressive families in Elmira, one of the most radical families in Elmira, who were station masters on the Underground Railroad, who were founders of the first college to grant degrees to women, who founded a church specifically because the church that they previously belonged to was not willing to come out against slavery, who set up the first co-educational, fully integrated school in New York State for primary and secondary education, who created a philanthropic organization by and for women dedicated to industrial education to free those women from abusive relationships. That they funded one of the most notorious conductors on the Underground Railroad, a guy named John W. Jones, who ushered more than 800 families to freedom. It was the family he entered into, what Max Eastman, another local Elmiran who becomes a literary figure and political activist in the early 20th century, he says Mark Twain married into the gospel of revolt, right? That the family he joined, his in-laws, were more egalitarian, more radical than he was when he joined them, right? And so in some ways, right, that sense of egalitarianism is produced by the growth of his family as much as he actually contributes to it. Now, we do have some moments late in his life where he has become a far more radical figure, and some really interesting moments where he sort of chastises his daughters for accepting some of the racial archetypes of the time. And specifically, the one that always sticks out for me is, he insists that Jesus was Black, right? And so at a time when that was, obviously not a popular or common opinion, he was willing to take it in conversation in a letter to his daughter. Twain is cited all the time in the UK as an antidote to the rampant anti-Semitism in this country at the highest level. I don't know specifically about the UK, the contemporary UK context, right? But I do think that this, Twain as anti-imperialist, right, as somebody who is sort of anti-racist, that's something that's, I hope to see us become more and more a common part of his legacy moving forward. Mouse, yeah, that's actually one of the examples I was thinking about, right? That Mouse, was attempted to be banned from a curriculum and has seen a surge in sales as a result. It's a great example. Thank you so much, everybody. I really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed your questions, and so pleased to have been able to be part of this. And I invite you, if you have any questions, if you'd like to follow up, please check out the Center for Mark Twain Studies at marktwainstudies.org. You can find all sorts of information about Twain there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's attended this My Jewish Learning event. Have a wonderful day, and the recording will soon be up.